Welcome to Compelling Topics, the only channel dedicated to the perspective of leading researchers from the Italian independent scene. Let's turn your minds on. This is the third episode of Fringe Friday, and today we continue our journey into the Giza Plateau with the contribution of Armando Mei. In this episode, Mei presents his segment of the conference held in Spoleto on July 27, 2025, focusing on historical interpretation, architectural anomalies, and the broader context in which scientific data and ancient knowledge intersect. As always, the aim is not to offer definitive answers, but to ask better questions and to examine the evidence from a critical, open-minded perspective. Armando Mei is an independent researcher, historian, and scholar of ancient Egypt, widely known for his critical and multidisciplinary work on the Giza Plateau and ancient civilizations. Born in Turin in 1967, Mei began his career as an investigative journalist before specializing in historical and archaeological research, integrating unconventional perspectives with interdisciplinary analytical methods. He is the author of several books focused on reinterpreting ancient civilizations, including 36,400 BC, The Secret of the Gods, in which he proposes an alternative chronological and functional interpretation of Egyptian monuments, along with other works dedicated to historical and archaeological mysteries. As a member of the Kefren Research Project, he collaborates with an international team of researchers to explore and reinterpret the subterranean structures of the Giza Plateau using advanced technologies and innovative theoretical models. Mei has participated in international conferences and regularly contributes to scientific debates, lectures, and public forums focused on ancient civilizations and their unresolved enigmas. First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here. From this perspective, the view is extraordinary. You are incredible, and really, save the applause for yourselves. My role within the Kefren Project is to support the team in the analysis of the strictly historical and archaeological aspects. I am not an archaeologist, fortunately, I would say. I am not an Egyptologist either, because otherwise I would probably be standing here today repeating the usual narrative. Pyramids as tombs, king lists taken as absolute truth, documents like the Turin Canon or the Inventory Stela treated as historically reliable when, in reality, they are not. Luckily, like many other researchers who work independently on these subjects, although I personally reject the distinction between academic and alternative, because research is one and indivisible, I have had the mental freedom to approach this material from a different angle. And what has emerged over time has been fundamental. It has supported our work by helping us assemble pieces of a puzzle that allow us to reconstruct a history that has been deliberately, or sometimes naturally, fragmented. That is essentially my task. One of the fundamental starting points was the need to bring order to the enormous confusion of information, theories, counter-theories, and narratives surrounding the pyramids, and the Giza Plateau in particular. You all know how many hypotheses have been proposed over the last century. The real turning point came when the megastructures identified through SAR technology, using what we now call the Biondi protocol, began to emerge. These discoveries allowed us to read history from a completely different perspective. At that point, the questions became unavoidable. What were these structures for? How were they built? When were they built? It became necessary to construct a chronological framework capable of supporting what was gradually emerging from beneath the ground of Giza itself. This meant working rigorously, not only with myths, and no longer exclusively with what has been told about Egyptian civilization for decades, but integrating data from other scientific disciplines. In particular, we had to take seriously the study of major geological events that have shaped our planet, at least over the last 100,000 years. Another crucial aspect was changing the lens through which we observe Giza. We adopted multidisciplinary models of investigation based on mathematics, physics, chemistry, geology, astronomy, and more. Only by bringing all these elements together could we focus properly on the monuments that complete the entire Giza Plateau. And when I say Giza Plateau, I do not mean only the pyramids or the Sphinx. I mean the entire monumental complex, structures such as the so-called Tomb of the Birds to the west, the valley temples of the Sphinx, and many other elements that complete a global project. Giza must be studied as a whole, in a complex and integrated way. Now, one of the most important aspects for reconstructing the chronology of events is a catastrophic episode that occurred between 75,000 and 70,000 BCE, the eruption of the Toba supervolcano in Indonesia. According to anthropologists, this event may have caused a genetic bottleneck for humanity. Our species came close to extinction. It was a global phenomenon that heavily affected the southern hemisphere. Meanwhile, the northern hemisphere was in the Pleistocene era and largely covered by ice. Giza, however, lay within a tropical climatic zone. Imagine not a desert, but a lush, fertile environment. Why is this important? Because this scientifically documented catastrophe may have triggered large-scale phenomena, including the submergence of continental areas. Classical literature speaks of Atlantis. This event may explain the disappearance of that continent, whatever its original name was, as well as others known in different traditions as Lemuria or Mu. According to mythological narratives, the survivors of that catastrophe migrated to the land of Kem, ancient Egypt, giving rise to what we know as Zep Tepi, the first time, dated roughly between 40,000 and 36,000 BCE. Another fundamental event marking the end of this earlier civilization occurred between 11,000 and 9,000 BCE, often centered around 10,500 BCE, a date also supported by earlier studies such as those of Robert Bauval. This was a second, scientifically recognized catastrophic event that effectively erased the remnants of that civilization. This is why the myth of Atlantis is so important. Plato's account matters not merely as philosophy, but because in Egypt, particularly at Edfu, there are texts that reference a pre-catastrophic civilization. These texts are sometimes hermetic, but they clearly speak of a culture that survived a disaster. They describe a civilization that lived on an island. Recently, an American researcher with whom I have collaborated in the past, Manethos Safadik, claims to have identified a hieroglyphic reference to the name Atlantis itself, Utlan, within these texts. If confirmed, this would be extraordinary evidence. Another controversial but significant source are the Emerald Tablets. While we have no definitive proof of their historical accuracy, what is emerging beneath Giza suggests intriguing correlations, especially with the description of the city of Ameni. One striking element is the presence of deep shafts across the Giza Plateau, particularly around the Great Pyramid and the southeastern area near the Sphinx and the Causeway of Khafre. Many of these shafts are now obstructed, but they display highly consistent characteristics that we detected during our surveys. We do not use the Emerald Tablets as proof, but certain elements undeniably resonate with what we are observing. Perhaps the most crucial point is the relationship between myth and ancient historical events. Our only sources are texts, often confused, fragmented, but texts such as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Pyramid texts, and the Amduat contain narratives with unmistakable historical overtones. I am referring, in particular, to the Battle of Heliopolis and the conflict between Set and Osiris. According to these texts, the followers of Set were brought to Giza and annihilated before the tribunal of Adam. This event coincides with the beginning of Zep Tepi. These followers are called the Seba. Official interpretations describe them as canine-headed beings. However, alternative studies associate the Seba with Papiocynocephaly, yellow baboons, whose cranial structure shares numerous similarities with that of Neanderthals. This leads to a provocative hypothesis. The Sebaw may have been Neanderthals. Their extinction occurred precisely between 40,000 and 38,000 BCE. Traces of Neanderthals have been found in the Nile Delta, suggesting a far broader geographical presence than commonly assumed. Using comparative translations of the Book of the Dead, particularly those by Wallace Budge and Boris de Requilts, I focused only on passages where the translations closely aligned. These texts clarify that Zep-Tepi does not mark the reign of Osiris, but the night when his powers were transferred to Horus. It marks the beginning of the age of the demigods. The cause of the conflict was the conquest of the scepters of Horus, associated with Heliopolis, the city of obelisks. These structures were not merely symbolic. They embodied a memory of a function so important that it may have sparked a fratricidal war. Hieroglyphic representations of Heliopolis depict inverted obelisks, pointing downward, with a vertical axis rising upward. This detail preserves the memory of those ancient rods, whose function we still struggle to understand. These texts also contain precise geographical references, real locations in the Nile Delta, suggesting that what we are reading is not myth, but history preserved as memory. From there, the challenge became correlating this forgotten history with the Giza Plateau. The absence of inscriptions inside the pyramids is often cited as proof of their dynastic origin. This is false. Numerous royal tombs contain inscriptions, including those from earlier dynasties, such as the tomb of Khafre. Other analytical models, numerological, astronomical, and mathematical, reinforce the conclusion that the pyramid's dimensions are derived from the first 4 prime numbers. And that realization, over time, led me to understand that the origins of these monuments are far older and far more complex than we have been told. In particular, the numbers 3, 5, and 7 emerge as central in defining the heights, while 11 functions as a fundamental constant common to all 3. In the Pyramid of Khafre, however, before reaching the direct relationship between 3 and 11, a crucial intermediate step appears, the number 137. This value arises from the application of prime factorization and becomes a transitional point through which, by applying the function, we are able to return to the origin of the generative constants underlying the very structure of the pyramid. The number 137 plays a pivotal role throughout this theoretical framework, not only because of its profound connections with physics, but also due to its archetypal and symbolic significance. Traditionally, 137 is associated with the concept of entry into the divine house of life, a meaning that proves strikingly consistent with the conceptual foundation of the Kefren Project. This entire line of research stems from an effort to understand the relationship between 137, the idea of an entrance, and the ordering principle that we believe guided the design of the entire structure. For this reason, we have intensified our investigation into this aspect as well, convinced that in the near future it will be possible to develop a more rigorous technical model, grounded in physical principles, capable of describing in a detailed and quantitative way the relationship between this number, the pyramids, and the overall architectural framework we are progressively reconstructing. It is a complex endeavor requiring time and patience, but the direction is now clearly defined. Another important point concerns the broader context in which this research is taking place. The work we are carrying forward, with considerable effort, encounters significant resistance in certain academic circles. For example, a conference had been scheduled in Dubai, to which Zahi Hawass had also been invited. Upon learning of the presence of the Italian team, and above all of our request to organize a roundtable for a scientific exchange between our project and the Scan Pyramids project, Hawass chose to withdraw from the event. This disappointed us not because of the absence of a specific individual, but because a valuable opportunity for dialogue was lost. The exchange of information is, in fact, a fundamental element of scientific progress. Refusing dialogue ultimately means halting the very possibility of advancing our understanding. I emphasize this episode because research today is heavily influenced by external factors. There are power dynamics that view this kind of work with discomfort. This does not surprise us, but it does raise concern. We are referring to influential groups tied to consolidated power structures, including environments connected to high-level Freemasonry, which observe our work with suspicion because, evidently, it disrupts established equilibria. At this point, I will briefly open and close a parenthesis. Online, I have seen my name associated with a Masonic lodge. I want to state this clearly. I am not a member of any lodge. On the contrary, I invite anyone making such claims to specify the name, number, and location of the alleged lodge so that I may at least be aware of it should someone ever ask me. That said, it must be acknowledged that these power environments have been the subject of serious academic study in the past. I am thinking, for instance, of the work of Miriam Fusel, a professor of philosophy at the University of Frankfurt, who conducted an in-depth analysis of the so-called occult schools of power, the Illuminati, the Templars, the Rosicrucians, and other similar groups. According to her research, each of these schools preserves a fragment of truth, yet it is precisely their mutual opposition that generates conflict and destabilization on a global scale. Many of the events that shape our society, from economics to politics, stem from these dynamics of confrontation. In this sense, humanity ultimately becomes an unconscious instrument of power games that determine the conditions of everyday life. Nevertheless, we continue to do what we believe is right. We carry on our work without fear, fully aware of the risks, but also of the value of what we are doing. Scientific criticism is always welcome because it fosters dialogue and growth. What we do not accept are personal attacks, often fueled by those who exploit people's good faith to gain visibility on social media. Those who refuse direct confrontation, who disappear when invited to engage on a technical and scientific level, simply demonstrate that they have nothing of substance to contribute. To these individuals, we say that our work continues, is carefully monitored, and will not be halted by sterile polemics. Our final objective is clear: to dismantle a body of unfounded narratives that have been repeated for decades and to rewrite the history of the pyramids in a more rigorous, coherent, and data-driven manner. It is an ambitious task, but a necessary one. And on this point, we will not turn back. This concludes episode 3 of Fringe Friday, featuring the intervention of Armando Mei and his contribution to the ongoing investigation into the Giza complex. If you want to follow the entire series, make sure to check the Fringe Friday playlist, where all episodes will be collected in order. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter on Compelling Topics.